We all know the memes where Tux the Penguin is breaking free from Windows, or cleaning up Windows, or whatever else. Those are all fun and enjoyable, yes, but do you know what Linux actually is? Well, stick around and let's find out.
You smell that? It smells like a bit goblin.
Going by the official definition, technically speaking, Linux is just the Linux kernel, and in case you don't know what a kernel is, in layman's terms, it's the piece of software that sits in the background of an operating system like Windows or Mac OS to translate and facilitate transactions between the software and the hardware. In other words, when an application like Firefox or Thunderbird requests to access your system's memory or storage device, the kernel will translate those requests into something your CPU can understand, so it can go out and pull that file or whatever else that was requested. The Linux kernel in particular is notable because it is open source, extremely popular, and used a lot for what are called Linux distributions. And it is one of the largest, if not the largest, open source project, with about 11,250 contributors and closing in on 1 million commits on GitHub. Over the years, the Linux kernel has grown massively, with each version cleaning up bugs, adding new features, and expanding its compatibility with new hardware, becoming the behemoth it is today, being heavily used for servers across the internet, popular for developer workstations, and is even getting some popularity in terms of gaming. The Linux kernel was even used by Google in their Android operating system for smartphones. And this all stems from what was initially merely a hobby project to create a Unix-like operating system for AT386 systems by an individual named Linus Torvalds in 1991. Some of its early major milestones were its first initial release with version 0.01 on September 17th, 1991. Next, version 0.12 was the first version where Linus adopted the GNU General Public License version 2, or GPL v2 for short, which is the project's current license. And Linux 1.0 was released on March of 1994, which was kind of when Linux was being seen as more of a stable, more production-ready system. And of course, there were a lot more events in Linux's history, but I'm not going to bore you with them all here. Around the same time, the GNU or GNU project was gaining some steam, with their goal to create a completely open source and free operating system, this one called GNU Herd. They actually ended up getting most of the way there, creating pretty much all of the utilities needed for an operating system, except for a kernel. Eventually, a lot of the GNU utilities ended up being ported to the Linux kernel and started being packaged together to provide users with a complete operating system, all of it open source, and creating the basis of what we know today as Linux distributions. Of course, this meant a shift in focus for the GNU project away from GNU Herd, though if you're curious about it, they do still occasionally work on it, the last release being about 4.5-5 years ago. This was a gross oversimplification of events, so if you're interested in more of the details, then go head over to Wikipedia or go do some Googling on the history of the Linux kernel to get those details. But this all leads very well into my next point, that Linux these days usually refers to those Linux distributions in a general sense, not just one distribution, and really not the kernel anymore. That whole spiel by Richard Stallman, you know the one, of what you're referring to as Linux is in fact GNU/Linux, or as I've recently taken to call it GNU plus Linux, comes from the fact that what is referred to as Linux is actually the Linux kernel plus utilities from the GNU project to form a complete OS. And to be fair, this is technically true, but sometimes you just gotta roll with the punches. And honestly, sometimes it just makes him look like a sore loser. Anyways, these Linux distributions are the equivalent of Windows or Mac OS, a complete operating system that you can use to boot your computer and get work done. And if you're interested in installing one to check it out, go check out my last video on how to install Linux. There are tons of different distros available, some of the popular ones being Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Manjaro, and Fedora, which are more focused on desktop use cases. Others are more focused on server or more stable use cases such as Debian or Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and there are still a lot of others, some being more of a joke like Hannah Montana Linux. All of these options are good in that if you're not quite happy with one of the distros, you can easily hop on over to another one to suit your tastes. Though at the same time, all of these choices does create a bit of a rift in the community, with everyone fighting over which one is the best, and it can be a lot to present to new users, who will likely get scared after seeing quite literally hundreds of distributions available. Yikes. But why would anyone want to use Linux? Everything runs just fine on Windows, right? And isn't Linux anyway just for crazy neckbeards who live and breathe code? Well, first there are some advantages that Linux has over Windows. First and most importantly, in my opinion, is that Linux distributions don't track you like Windows or Mac OS does. You know, on Windows, all those telemetry setting toggles that are a pain to turn off, and even then, you still need to make some registry edits to really disable everything. And even then, it's not 100% clear if there's anything else sending telemetry. Typically speaking, Linux distributions will have maybe 1 or 2 toggles for sending usage telemetry that is really easy to just uncheck, and a lot of times is even presented to you when installing. And in some cases, there might even be another if you want to enable location services. So there really isn't a whole lot of pain if you don't want to send that telemetry, and you can if you really choose to. And since Linux distributions are virtually always open source, you can verify this if you know how to read source code or have a friend that you can trust that can do so. Another reason to use Linux is that it is extremely customizable. I don't mean just that you can change the colors, icon set, and stuff, but you can also change your entire desktop if you so desire. Some of the common desktops are the Cinnamon desktop environment, since it has a very Windows-like experience. GNOME, because it is very clean-looking and simple, kinda. And Mate, because it is a continuation of the old and familiar GNOME 2 desktop, and is a very simple and lightweight experience. One common complaint against Linux is that X software does not run on Linux. And yes, if you want to have the utmost assurance of software compatibility for desktop applications, then Windows is likely the best option. But most software these days that people will want to run does run on Linux. Web browsers like Firefox, Chrome, and Opera, email clients like Thunderbird, Office productivity suites like LibreOffice, OpenOffice, and FreeOffice, media production applications like Audacity, Kdenlive, and Inkscape. Text editors like Sublime Text and Visual Studio Code. You name it, it probably runs on Linux, or at least has a viable alternative. Even games these days usually run through Steam, whether it uses a native Linux runtime or uses Steam's Proton compatibility layer to run Windows games, and even then, Lutris can handle other games that aren't covered by Steam. The Adobe Suite and Microsoft Office, however, are the only big names of software that I can think of right now that don't run on Linux, even through compatibility layers like Wine, but chances are you can get by without them or something similar to them. As for the neckbeards, there are plenty of user-friendly distributions available to newbies and experienced users alike. If you're new, usually I'd recommend starting with something like Linux Mint or Pop! OS if you're starting out, since those are more newbie-friendly. Linux Mint looking rather similar to Windows in its default configuration, and Pop! OS being a bit of a different desktop paradigm, and both are rather easy to work with. There are plenty of other reasons to use Linux, and a lot more to the history of Linux. But hopefully this video was enough to pique your interest and get you started down the rabbit hole that is Linux and learn a bit more. Let me know if you liked it by hitting one of the like buttons down below. Leave a comment if your feelings are more complex. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming videos. And go join my Discord server to join the community that is starting up. Otherwise, I will catch you in the next one.